There is a moment in many intelligent lives when the greatest obstacle is no longer external difficulty, but internal paralysis. Not the absence of ideas, not the lack of capability, but the strange sensation that the mind, once fluid and decisive, has become heavy, hesitant, almost motionless. Thoughts exist, plans exist, even intentions exist, yet action does not follow. This state is often misunderstood as laziness, exhaustion, or loss of motivation. In reality, what is happening is far more precise. The mental system has lost its movement mechanics. Mental movement is not simply the ability to think, it is the ability to transition from thought to execution without excessive internal resistance. When that transition becomes obstructed, even the most capable individuals begin to feel as though they are stuck, not because they lack intelligence, but because the internal processes that convert clarity into motion are no longer functioning efficiently. Recovering this movement is not a matter of inspiration. It is a matter of reactivating specific cognitive mechanisms that have quietly slowed down over time. The first code for restoring mental movement is decision compression. Many people assume that paralysis occurs because they lack sufficient information. In fact, paralysis more often occurs because the decision window has been stretched far beyond what is necessary. The mind begins to believe that every decision must be perfectly optimized, fully analyzed, and permanently correct. When this expectation becomes standard, the cost of deciding increases so dramatically that the system begins to avoid decisions entirely. Motion stops not because direction is unknown, but because the internal price of choosing has become artificially inflated. Decision compression reverses this condition by deliberately reducing the time and complexity allocated to non-critical decisions. Not reckless decision-making, but proportionate decision-making. When small and medium-level decisions are made quickly, the cognitive system preserves energy for the few decisions that truly require deep analysis. Movement returns because the mind is no longer attempting to solve every step of life with the intensity required for the most complex problems. Precision thinking must be applied selectively, or it becomes a source of inertia. Observe how often mental stagnation begins with excessive internal debates over relatively minor steps. When to begin, which version to start with, whether the conditions are ideal, whether the outcome will be optimal. Each additional internal negotiation adds friction. Friction slows movement. Eventually, the system unconsciously learns that starting is psychologically expensive, and avoidance becomes the easier path. Decision compression removes this friction by establishing predefined rules. Certain categories of decisions are made immediately, without prolonged internal negotiation. The result is not impulsiveness, it is restored flow. An interesting phenomenon occurs when individuals begin applying this principle consistently. They discover that clarity often emerges after movement begins, not before. Many insights that seemed inaccessible while thinking suddenly appear during execution. This is because the brain operates differently when engaged in action. Analytical loops that once felt endless begin to resolve themselves as real feedback replaces hypothetical speculation. Mental movement generates information. Stillness generates only additional speculation. Consider applying this immediately in a simple way. Choose one area of your daily routine where you often delay small decisions, perhaps the starting moment of a task, the first version of a project, or the next concrete step in an ongoing effort. Establish a fixed rule. The decision will be made within a defined short interval, regardless of emotional hesitation. Once the rule exists, negotiation disappears. And when negotiation disappears, motion accelerates almost automatically. There is also a deeper psychological effect worth noting. When the mind repeatedly experiences itself making timely decisions, it begins to rebuild confidence in its own operational speed. Many people who feel mentally slow are not actually slow thinkers. They are trapped in prolonged internal evaluation cycles. Compress the cycles, and the perceived speed of thinking returns. Confidence follows not from affirmations, but from repeatedly observing your own decisiveness in action. If you are noticing how often hesitation has been less about complexity and more about overextended decision loops, take a moment later to write a simple operational principle somewhere visible. Not every decision deserves maximum analysis. This single adjustment, applied consistently, can dramatically increase cognitive momentum. And if this idea is already prompting you to reconsider how you approach everyday choices, consider sharing in the comments one small decision you will begin compressing starting today. Public declaration often strengthens execution because it transforms intention into commitment. However, decision compression alone is not sufficient. Many individuals regain the ability to decide quickly, yet still experience difficulty sustaining mental movement over time. They begin with energy, but the momentum fades, and the sense of internal stagnation quietly returns. This occurs because the second mechanism governing mental motion has not yet been addressed: the continuity of cognitive engagement. Without continuity, movement starts but does not sustain. The next code will focus precisely on that: how to restore uninterrupted mental progression so that thought, decision, and action begin operating again as a unified system rather than isolated bursts of effort. The second code for recovering mental movement is continuity anchoring. Many individuals believe their difficulty lies in starting, when in fact the deeper problem is fragmentation. They begin something, stop midway, return later with diminished context, and must spend significant energy reconstructing where they left off. Each restart consumes cognitive resources, and after enough interruptions, the mind unconsciously begins to avoid deep engagement altogether because it anticipates the cost of re-entry. What appears to be lack of focus is often the predictable consequence of broken continuity. Continuity anchoring is the deliberate creation of psychological bridges between working sessions so that the mind never has to restart from zero. Instead of ending an activity at the point of completion, you end it at the point of next clarity. Before stepping away, define the exact next action that will occur when you return. Not a vague note such as "continue later," but a precise operational marker. The next paragraph to write, the next calculation to complete, the next section to analyze. This small adjustment dramatically reduces the mental energy required to resume, because the system already knows where movement will continue. Observe how often mental resistance appears strongest at the beginning of a session. That resistance is not always emotional. It is frequently cognitive uncertainty. The brain dislikes undefined starting points because they require reconstruction of context. When continuity anchors exist, the starting point becomes obvious. Motion resumes with minimal friction. Over time, this produces a powerful effect. The mind begins to perceive ongoing work not as a series of disconnected efforts, but as a continuous trajectory. And continuity, more than intensity, is what sustains long-term cognitive momentum. Another dimension of continuity anchoring involves reducing the number of simultaneous open cognitive threads. Many people attempt to maintain multiple, partially completed efforts at once, believing this reflects productivity. In practice, each open thread occupies background attention, subtly draining mental bandwidth. The result is a persistent sensation of mental heaviness, even when no single task is particularly difficult. By intentionally limiting the number of active cognitive streams and maintaining clear continuation points for each, the mind regains the sensation of forward flow instead of scattered pressure. there is a useful mental exercise you can implement immediately. At the end of your working period today, before closing your materials, write a single sentence describing the exact next step you will execute when you return. Keep it visible. When the next session begins, do not review everything from the beginning. Execute that step immediately. Notice how much faster engagement occurs. The system bypasses hesitation because continuity has already been engineered. If you are recognizing how much of your mental fatigue has come not from effort itself, but from repeatedly restarting effort, take a moment later to write a simple reminder. I leave clear bridges for my future self. This principle ensures that each session begins where the previous one ended, preserving cognitive momentum across time. And if this approach is already shifting how you think about your daily workflow, consider sharing in the comments one activity where you will begin using continuity anchors. Declaring it often increases the likelihood that the method becomes habit rather than theory. Yet even with faster decisions and stronger continuity, mental movement can still weaken if a third factor is missing. Movement requires not only direction and continuity, but also psychological permission to proceed without excessive internal opposition. Many individuals unknowingly carry hidden cognitive brakes. Perfectionism, fear of premature judgment, or the belief that only flawless progress is acceptable. These internal constraints slow the system, even when the mechanics of decision and continuity are functioning properly. The third code addresses precisely this final barrier: how to remove internal resistance thresholds so that the mind can operate at its natural speed without waiting for unrealistic conditions of certainty or perfection. The third code for recovering mental movement is threshold relaxation. Many highly capable individuals unknowingly operate with internal standards so rigid that the mind hesitates before producing anything imperfect. The intention behind these standards is often noble, the desire to create something precise, elegant, or meaningful. Yet when the acceptable threshold for action becomes too high, movement slows dramatically. The mind begins to wait for the ideal formulation, the correct timing, or the fully refined version before allowing execution. What appears to be careful thinking is frequently perfection-induced stagnation. Threshold relaxation does not mean abandoning quality. It means separating the stages of production from the stages of refinement. When the brain is forced to generate and perfect simultaneously, cognitive load increases sharply. The result is hesitation. But when production is allowed to occur first, in imperfect form, refinement becomes easier because material now exists to be improved. Movement resumes because the system is no longer blocked by the expectation of immediate excellence. Excellence becomes a process rather than a prerequisite. Notice how many stalled ideas exist, not because they lack potential, but because their initial versions were never allowed to exist. Entire projects remain theoretical because the mind insisted on producing a finished result on the first attempt. This expectation quietly transforms creativity into pressure. Pressure reduces speed. Reduced speed gradually evolves into avoidance. Over time, the individual begins to interpret the slowdown as loss of ability, when in reality, it is the consequence of an unrealistic internal threshold. There is a practical method for implementing threshold relaxation. Deliberately produce the first version at a defined speed limit, not a defined quality limit. For example, allocate a fixed interval in which the objective is simply to generate output continuously without pausing to evaluate its perfection. Once the interval ends, the refinement stage begins separately. This two-phase structure restores movement because the brain understands that imperfection during the first phase is not failure, it is operational design. The pressure that once blocked action disappears, replaced by a predictable sequence. Create first, optimize later. Another psychological advantage emerges when this code is practiced consistently. As individuals repeatedly witness that imperfect beginnings do not prevent high-quality final outcomes, their tolerance for early-stage uncertainty increases. The fear that once slowed execution loses credibility because experience has demonstrated a reliable path from rough initiation to refined completion. Confidence grows not from believing that everything will be perfect, but from knowing that imperfection can be corrected through iteration. Take a moment to consider how many times mental movement has slowed in your own life because the starting standard was silently set too high. Perhaps an idea was delayed until you felt more prepared, a message postponed until you found the perfect wording, a project deferred until conditions seemed ideal. Each of these moments represents a threshold that quietly restricted motion. Lower the starting threshold, and movement returns almost immediately. If this realization is resonating with you, write somewhere visible a simple operational instruction. Progress first, precision next. This statement reminds the mind that speed at the beginning does not threaten quality at the end. It enables it. And if this approach is already changing how you interpret hesitation, consider sharing below one area where you will allow yourself to produce an imperfect first version today. Declaring it often transforms intention into execution. When decision compression, continuity anchoring, and threshold relaxation begin operating together, mental movement does not merely return, it stabilizes. Decisions occur at appropriate speed, engagement continues across time without costly restarts, and internal resistance no longer blocks early action. The mind begins to function the way it was designed to function, exploring, producing, adjusting, and advancing in steady cycles rather than in isolated bursts of effort. What once felt like being mentally stuck reveals itself as a set of adjustable mechanisms. And once mechanisms are understood, they can be reconfigured deliberately, allowing clarity to convert into action again with the natural momentum that has always been available beneath the surface. There is an important realization that often arrives after these three codes begin to operate. Mental movement is not a talent reserved for a few people. It is the natural state of a system that has removed unnecessary friction. When decisions are compressed, continuity is preserved, and thresholds are relaxed, the mind stops fighting itself. It begins to advance with a quiet efficiency that feels almost effortless compared to the previous state of hesitation. What once required emotional pressure now requires only structural clarity. Many individuals spend years trying to become more motivated, when in reality they need to become less obstructed. Motivation fluctuates. Structure sustains. Once the internal environment is configured correctly, action no longer depends on inspiration to begin or continue. It becomes the expected next step. This shift changes not only productivity, but also the way a person experiences thinking itself. Thoughts feel lighter because they are no longer trapped in endless preparation loops. They are allowed to move forward into execution where they naturally evolve. Another subtle transformation occurs as mental movement stabilizes, self-perception changes. A person who repeatedly experiences themselves moving forward, even in small increments, gradually stops identifying as someone who is stuck. Identity adjusts to match observed behavior. This is not psychological optimism, it is a simple cognitive update. The mind trusts what it witnesses consistently. When it repeatedly witnesses motion, it begins to expect motion. Expectation then reduces hesitation further, creating a reinforcing cycle that strengthens over time. There is also an emotional benefit that should not be underestimated. Much of the anxiety associated with unfinished goals comes not from the difficulty of the goals themselves, but from the persistent sense of stalled progress. When movement resumes, even modestly, tension decreases. The system relaxes because it detects forward direction. This is why taking a small step often produces immediate psychological relief. The mind interprets movement as regained control. Control restores calm, and calm improves decision quality, further accelerating the cycle. At this point, the essential question is no longer whether you are capable of recovering mental movement, but whether you are willing to operate according to these codes consistently enough for them to become automatic. Consistency is where transformation becomes visible. Occasional application produces temporary relief. Repeated application redesigns how the mind functions day after day. The objective is not perfection in applying these methods, but persistence. Even partial implementation, maintained over time, generates measurable change. Take a moment now to identify one decision you will compress, one activity where you will create a continuity anchor, and one area where you will intentionally lower the initial execution threshold. These 3 adjustments, applied within the next 24 hours, are sufficient to begin altering the internal mechanics that control your cognitive momentum. When you act on them, observe the immediate difference in how easily movement begins compared to the past. That observation itself becomes reinforcing evidence that the system is already changing. If this perspective has helped you understand your own mental stagnation in a clearer, more technical way, write below a simple commitment: I restore movement step by step. This short declaration functions as a reminder that progress is not the result of waiting for clarity, but of activating the mechanisms that generate clarity through action. And if you want to continue exploring the precise behavioral frameworks that convert thought into consistent forward motion, remain connected here and share this with someone who may also be waiting for the right moment to begin. Because the right moment rarely arrives on its own. It is constructed through the first deliberate step.